Hello everybody, today we're going to talk about imperialism in Asia. Alright, so we've already kind of hit some of this when we talked about the British involved in India, but today we're going to talk about largely what is happening in China and in Central Asia. So for the most part, the British are really going to have a limited interaction with most of Asia, and really the rest of Europe is going to have a limited interaction with most of Asia. To this point in Asian history, kind of Asia's dictated the terms as to what's going on here. The Europeans are really far away, and this is going to pose a problem for really consistent interaction. And when they do interact, it's largely going to be on the terms of the Chinese, because the spice trade and the Oriental trade and the Oriental Express, when all that stuff happens, is going to be something that's very much directed by the Asian cultures involved. Well, with the birth of the Industrial Revolution and the Second Industrial Revolution, that's really going to change. This massive shift in kind of global control happens largely because the Industrial Revolution provides Europeans a power source that is going to allow them to travel to Asia much quicker than they used to have before. And that's going to be coal. Coal is going to change the game plan here. It's going to change the balance of power of the globe. Really, prior to this, it was in favor of Asia, and now it's very much going to be in favor of the Europeans. So today we're going to start with Central Asia. Central Asia itself is not going to be as, glamorous as when you talk about things like China and other places, and it's a lot of places that we're not really as familiar with. But this is going to be huge because these places are going to play a major role in what happens in the 20th century around the world, particularly in areas like the Cold War, and even today when we're talking about Chechnya and Georgia and Vladimir Putin and all the fun stuff that he does. Alright, this is going to be a story that almost exclusively talks about Russia. After the loss in the Crimean War, Russia is really trying to reestablish itself as a major power. And we already talked about this a little bit, and we talked about how Russia is trying to, rebuild itself and industrialize and really get back on its feet. Well, part of the goal for this is going to be really showing it still has that imperial power around the world. So they're going to try to make gains in various different places. Places like the Transcaucasus region, the Central Asia, Middle Asia, which we know more as Kazakhstan, and then eventually, places like Afghanistan, and then the very far east. So this is going to be an interesting period, because some of these are going to be a little bit more successful than other ones. And some of them are going to have a few unintended consequences that the Russian people could have never known about. Alright, so first up, they're going to take advantage of what is known as the Caucasus area. This is going to be an area that for a while now has been controlled by the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire, as we've talked about, is really just holding on by a thread. So groups like the Armenians and Chechens are going to be incorporated into this new Russian expansion that we see. The Armenian people do not like this. They're adamantly against it, and they're actually a group of people who have been passed back and forth between Russia and the Ottoman Empire for a while now. Now, knowing what we do about what happens to the Armenian people during the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Ottoman Empire, they probably would prefer today if they would have been under Russian control, but eventually this is passed on later on too. The Chechens, unfortunately, never have that opportunity, and this is actually still an issue today. When they're taken over by the Russian Empire, there is immediate resistance by everyone to Russian rule. There are going to be guerrilla fighters led by Imam Shamil, who is going to fight against the Russians. And what we're going to see is the farther east we get away from Europe, the more and more these peoples are not going to share really anything involved to Russian society. They're not going to have the same language. They're not going to share religion. The majority of these people are going to be Islamic. They are not going to be Christians, and they don't really have anything that they can tie themselves to the Russian Empire. And today we still see this problem as Chechnya is constantly trying to fight against the Russians to break away from Vladimir Putin today. While then we also see Far Eastern Asia. Far Eastern Asia is going to be a very different scenario for the Russians. They are going to attempt to expand their entire empire in order to really be able to transverse all of it via railroad. A massive transcontinental railroad that spanned the entirety of Russia and will allow for trade from Western Europe via railroad to East Asia, which would be a great economic opportunity for the Russians, something that no other European power can do. While in an attempt to gain the last piece of territory that they need, they're going to put themselves in direct confrontation with the Japanese. And to this point in history, that really hasn't been a problem. Well, as of 1900, the Japanese are actually a major player in the world figure again. In fact, the Japanese have completely modernized themselves. And they're going to modernize largely because of the United States, a story that you're going to get in about 5 minutes. But this is going to lead to a confrontation between the Russians and the Japanese called the Russo-Japanese War. And this is huge. It may not have seemed like it at the time, but the Russo-Japanese War is going to be a massive nail in the coffin of the Russian czars. Tsar Nicholas will attempt to attack the Japanese, hoping that they can take a little bit more territory. Territory today we know is Korea. And unfortunately, they're going to get beaten badly. And it's a very sad day. The Japanese destroy the Russians. And this is going to be a pretty catastrophic loss for the Russian people. They're going to have to deal with the fact that, up to this point in history, no European power has lost to an Asian power. So the Russians just became the first. This is pretty humiliating. How far has Russia fallen from its great days that this is what we have now? This is going to start rebuilding that momentum towards a Russian Revolution that will pick up with the return of Lenin to Russia. Alright, so let's talk about the United States. Shocker to a lot of people in the United States is not a country without its own colonies. We are actually one of the only remaining true empires on the planet, and that's not even an economic empire. We physically have territories across the globe still. This begins during this time period, and it begins largely with this single event called the sinking of the USS Maine. This is not an actual picture of the sinking of the USS Maine. It's an artist's representation of it. But this was a battleship that was sunk off the coast of Cuba. And this is going to incite a war with the Spanish, who still controlled Cuba, and then, various chunks of islands across the Caribbean and even some in Southeast Asia, places like Puerto Rico and the Philippines. Well, you can tell the story goes pretty easily for the United States. The United States absolutely obliterates the Spanish. We are at this point an ascending power. The United States is growing at an extraordinary rate. Spain hasn't really done much of note in the last, 200 years, other than kind of be pawns of the French and the Habsburgs over in Europe. Well, when this happens, the United States is going to gain a pretty significant global empire. When we absorb Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, plus the islands and places of Alaska that we've already gathered, that's a pretty impressive empire right there. To have an empire that spans the entirety of the Pacific Ocean, no other country had ever done this before. And the fact that we still control a significant chunk of these places today, Guam, ours. American Samoa, still ours. Hawaii, Alaska, totally states. Midway is ours. Puerto Rico is ours. This is going to lead to the United States becoming a major power in what's happening in the world. And we're not exactly done. We may not take any more direct colonies, but we will play a major role in imperialism in Far Asia. And it's going to begin with Japan. The United States is going to unintentionally wake up Japan when we send over Commodore Perry and a brand new American fleet that we're going to call the Great White Fleet. And this Great White Fleet, as you kind of see in the lower right as an artist representation, is going to waken up the Japanese people to the fact that they have completely fallen behind when it comes to industrialization. They are still relatively living in a feudal society. So when they see these massive industrial ships, they're going to panic. Because Commodore Perry comes to Tokyo and says, hey, you know what, we want to trade with you. And they're like, we don't have an answer for you right now. Can you come back later? And when they leave, Commodore Perry says, you know what, a year from now I'm going to come back. And I'm going to come back with more of these ships. There's going to be 15 of them. It's going to be awesome. And when they come back, the Japanese are aware of what's going to happen. And they have to open up some trade to the Americans. And they do. And when they do this, they open up Japan to Western trade in its entirety. This is going to open up Japan to the idea that maybe they need to make a few changes in their country. And this is called the Meiji Restoration. Not something we're really going to focus in this class because it's European history, but the Meiji Restoration is probably the single most impressive period of industrialization in world history. In the course of about 30 to 40 years, they will go from being a country that was 500 years behind technologically to being one of the most advanced countries on the planet, and by far the most advanced country in Asia. Well, that leaves us with one other place we need to talk about, and that's China. China is going to go into this period, roughly 1800. They are the dominant empire in the world. The British, while important in Europe, no one had anyone near the amount of power that existed in China. But short 50 years later, China is going to be a small fraction of what it used to be. It's going to be ripped apart by the Europeans, and even now the Japanese are going to play a role in what happens. And this picture is a great representation of that. You have a giant pizza here that is being divided up by the major powers. We have the Queen of England, we have the Kaiser, we have the Russian Tsar, we have Lady Liberty, and the Japanese Emperor, all of which taking a piece of China, the part that they want the best. Now, where does this begin? It begins with the fact that China's population is swelling, and we already talked about what happened with the Treaty of Nanjing and the opium trade and everything else. It's fallen apart extraordinarily quickly in China after that. Once we see massive chunks of the population become addicted to opium and the economic problems that arises, China itself is going to just start falling off a cliff very quickly. And the people of China are ready for a change. And we will actually see movements in the mid-1800s to actually remove the Chinese emperor and empress from control. First, we'll see Hong Xiquan develop what he calls the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. And it was an attempt to actually create a society where poverty wouldn't exist and the wealth of the nation is equally distributed. While this is very Marxist ideas, actually long before Marx really creates it, and it's actually going to lead to the massive Taiping Rebellion, where over 20 million Chinese people die. A rebellion that becomes so out of control that eventually European powers come in and completely quell it themselves because they're afraid of what happens if China completely destabilizes. Well, when this ends, the Chinese Empress comes back in control, Dowager Empress Cixi, and she thinks that now, you know what, maybe we should go ahead and try to improve China. We call this the self-strengthening movement. We're going to modernize China as much as possible using Western ideas. But when she does this, she opens up China to a bunch of new influences that they probably weren't prepared to deal with. And that is going to be things called spheres of influence. These various spheres are going to start dividing China into pieces, where various European powers are going to have control over all the trade and investment in that areas, effectively giving them chunks of China to kind of rule as their own. The United States will push upon an open door policy in China, saying, you know what, everyone should have access to China at any point in time. And this is going to start to destabilize the social structure of China very quickly. These spheres of influence, as you see the different colors, are huge chunks of Chinese influence disappearing. We'll see the French, the British, the Germans, the Japanese, and the Russians start to take pieces of China. And when they do this, the Chinese really have no response, except, we've got to find a way to get rid of these people, because it's destroying our country. The once great Chinese empire is falling flat on its face. So groups of Chinese people called the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, such a wonderful name, shortly known as the Boxers, are going to try to push the European powers out of China. The Dowager Empress supports them, but can't really support them because you can't actually, do anything against the Europeans. She's pretty scared crapless at this point. But they'd be defeated. The European powers will step in, this whole Boxer rebellion fails. And what ends up happening is imperialism in China will destroy it. The Chinese never really recover from the Boxer rebellion. And in fact, it's just going to be a slow period until the Chinese eventually abandon everything, the empire, the model, the empress, for a China that we're a little bit more familiar with today. A China where the power of a single librarian, a guy by the name of Mao Zedong, is going to bring communism to China. And when he does this, the world gets a little scared. Alright, thank you guys. You have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.